Hello and welcome to Rotary Rocketry. In our previous video, we discussed the specifications of Class 1 amateur rocketry, and then we built and flew a rocket that met those specifications. Now for that launch, we made a special motor, a new design we call the Dart Monkey motor. In this video, we're going to discuss the Class 1 specifications for amateur rocket motors, and we're going to show you step-by-step instructions on how to make that new motor. Now, the specifications provided by the FAA give two requirements for the rocket motor in Class 1. One of them is pretty simple and the other's not quite as simple. Let's touch on the simple one. Uses no more than 125 grams of propellant. So that's pretty easy. Our Dart Monkey motor is designed to hold exactly 125 grams of sugar fuel. Now the next specification is not quite as simple. It says it uses a slow burning propellant. So the problem with that specification is there's not enough information provided there. In order to say something is slow burning or fast burning, you need a point of reference or a comparison, and they don't provide that. So take a look at this illustration. Here we've got a turtle. The turtle is slow compared to the human being. But if we compare that turtle to a snail, you see that the turtle is actually fast. So the question is the turtle slow or is it fast? Well, it depends on the comparison. Without the comparison, it's just a turtle. Now let's actually compare our sugar fuel to itself. I know that sounds a little weird, but let me show you what I mean. So here I've got 125 grams of the sugar fuel that we're going to be using in today's motor. I've rolled it up into the cigar shape like this just for testing purposes. Let's see how it burns. Now this isn't sped up or slowed down, this is the actual burn rate. You see, it takes quite a long time to get from one end to the other. That took about 24 seconds for that entire piece of fuel to burn from one end to the other. If you're familiar with rocket fuel, you'll know that that is actually pretty slow. In fact, if we put that in a motor and it burnt at that rate, you'd never get a rocket off the launch rod. It wouldn't even put out enough thrust to lift the motor off the launch rod, let alone the weight of any kind of rocket. Now let's take a look at this video that we took when we were testing and building this motor. Now you see, that actually put out a lot of thrust. In fact, it pushed over our test stand, which is made out of steel, moved it about 6 feet, and the fuel was consumed in less than a quarter of a second. Now that was the same exact fuel, same exact quantity, but clearly in that situation it burnt extremely fast. So in order to determine whether the sugar fuel is fast or slow, not only do you need a comparison of something to compare it to see if it's faster or slower, but you also need to know what type of environment the fuel is in when you're testing it. Open air testing versus the pressures inside of a rocket motor make a huge difference. And even if we increase the nozzle size just a couple of sizes on that motor, it would slow the fuel rate down again. So none of that information is provided in the government specifications other than slow burning propellant. That simply can't be defined with the information they've given. So for that reason, to be perfectly honest, we're going to ignore that specification. So before we get to building this motor, let me just talk about the two popular rocketry associations, Tripoli and the NAR. Now, this particular motor we're going to build is not allowed at a Tripoli or NAR event. As of the time of this video, let me just explain their rules and regulations. So for Tripoli, they do allow experimental homemade motors. However, they do not allow PVC casings, and we are going to be using a PVC case motor. Also, interestingly enough, they do allow sugar motors, but they don't allow the sugar content to come from sucrose or fructose. Well, guess what? The sugar motor we're going to be building today has its sugars provided by sucrose and fructose. So, On the NAR side, the NAR does not allow any experimental homemade motors, so clearly this motor is not allowed at their events either. If you're launching for yourself or you have your own small little club or group or organization, you have your own rules. So you decide whether you want to have homemade motors or not. Now let's take a look at everything you're going to need to build this motor. First, some safety items, just a pair of gloves and some safety glasses. And then for the motor casing, we're using a piece of 1¼ PVC. This is Schedule 40 PVC. It's not the thin wall stuff used for irrigation. If you're not sure you have the right one, measure the inside diameter. It should be about 1.35 inches inside diameter. We've cut this piece to 4 3/8 of an inch long. And then we've got 2 1¼ PVC caps. One of these is going to have a hole drilled in it later for the nozzle. And to glue all that together, we've got some PVC primer and some standard PVC cement. To make the nozzle, we're going to be using some anchoring cement. Now, I have had people ask me if they can use Portland cement. Now, I've seen other people use that product, although I haven't used it before. Anchoring cement is mostly already Portland cement. It just has additives in it to make it stronger and bond better. So I do prefer and recommend anchoring cement. And then we've just got the washer that's going to form the nozzle opening. This is a 1-inch diameter fender washer. Now this hole in the middle here isn't very important right at the moment because we're going to drill this out to a number 19, which is 19/64 of an inch. So we just need to have a washer that has a hole that is smaller than 19/64 so we can drill that out. And then we've got an earplug. Now there's a couple of different styles of earplugs. This one really works best for this project just because of the shape, round on the bottom without any little wings sticking off of it. We'll need a couple of drills. The number 19 nozzle size is 19/64 of an inch, and then we'll need a 7/16 drill as well to drill the PVC cap. All right, for mixing up the fuel, we've got a couple of components. We've got potassium nitrate. Now, we purchased this in a powdered form already. You can also purchase potassium nitrate at the hardware store as stump remover. Check with the manufacturer's specifications if you are buying stump remover to make sure that their product is potassium nitrate. When you buy it in the stump remover form, it's going to come in small granules and you'll need to grind that up in a coffee grinder or in a blender to make it into a fine powder. Then we've got confectioner's sugar or powdered sugar available at the grocery store. And then we've got corn syrup. Now when you buy your corn syrup, look at the ingredients list. It should just be corn syrup, salt, and vanilla extract, nothing else. If you buy a cheaper version, you'll find that it has a water content. We do not want water in our fuel, so don't buy one that has water. For cooking the fuel, we've got a little electric cooktop. I've just got a small non-stick pan, stirring stick, and a spoon to help scrape some of that fuel off as we are stirring it and cooking it. We also have an infrared thermometer. Now there's several ways you could take the temperature of the fuel as you cook it, but this is the fastest and easiest way. In order to measure our components, we've got a small gram scale and just a little container for mixing the dry products together. We also have some cooking spray to help with our coring rod a little bit later to make sure that that doesn't stick to our fuel. Now, same thing here, you want to look at the ingredients on your cooking spray. The cheaper cooking sprays have water in them. Again, we do not want water coming in contact with our fuel, so don't buy the cheap cooking spray that has water. Now, this is our coring rod. This is a 3/4 inch steel rod. We've got a point on the end of it to help push through the fuel. Now this is a little bit longer than we need because we're only making the motor about half this length, but having a little extra length is not a bad thing here. And then we've made this custom tool. Now this is a piece of 3/4 inch MDF. This washer has been epoxied onto the top of it. Now the washer, outside diameter, fits nicely into the PVC pipe that we're using for the motor. And then the inside diameter that's drilled through the wood and through the washer is also a nice fit for the coring rod. This is very helpful for getting the coring rod centered while the fuel is cooling down. I drilled out the hole in the washer with the 19/64 drill bit. That gives us a number 19 nozzle opening. And then on one of the caps, I drilled a hole with the 7/16 drill bit. Now you can do this with a hand drill or with a drill press, but you do need to get that hole fairly close to the center. Now with the ear plug, you see that it is exactly 1 inch long. So I made some marks on it at the 1/2 inch point. That simply gets squished a little bit. We can put that onto the washer just so those little lines that we made at the 1/2 inch point are hidden by the washer. And we'll give that just a moment for that ear plug to re-expand. Once the ear plug is fully expanded, you can adjust it a little bit just to make sure that it's nice and straight through the washer. And then take this larger end, squish it down a little bit, and put it into the end cap. And again, we're just going to wait a moment for that to re-expand so it'll hold itself into the end cap. Now we're ready to glue the PVC pipe onto this cap. We're going to use the PVC primer first. The pipe needs to be primed, and then we'll also prime in here. Now I'm being a little bit careful here not to get primer, and I'll also be careful later not to get glue all over the ear plug and the washer that's in there. It's best to keep those nice and clean. And when you put these together, you want to push them all the way together till they seat and turn it about 1/4 of a turn. You need to hold that for about 20 seconds while that glue sets up. Now we just want to push the ear plug into the cap just a little bit. We want it to be flush with the end of the cap, but we don't want to push it in. So rather than take the risk of pushing it into the cap and actually having it fall out, we'll just get it really close like that, and then I can just press it gently against the table. And what that'll do is get it perfectly even with the bottom of the cap. Now we're ready to pour in our anchoring cement. I've got a little mixing cup here. I just like to use this little spoon, and I find that 2 heaping spoonfuls should be plenty. As far as how you have to mix up your particular anchoring cement depends on the brand and the style that you're using. So read the packaging and see what they want you to do. For this particular one, we're looking for a consistency that is similar to pancake batter. Now it's very easy to put too much water in and make it very, very soupy. So if you put too much water, just add a little bit more of the anchoring cement until you get the right consistency. And here's the consistency I'm looking for this particular one. Now I'm just going to pour that down right on top of that ear plug. It's going to flow around the washer and underneath. I want to get enough in there just to get to the washer. Just going to tap that and move it around, make sure that we don't get an air bubble trapped underneath the washer. And then I'm going to continue to fill that up. And what I'm doing is just filling it till we get to the top of the ear plug. We don't want to completely bury the ear plug. You'll still see a little dome of the ear plug sticking up. And for this brand, this takes about 20 minutes to set up. Again, read the packaging for yours, see how long you need to wait for it to set up. We're going to wait 20 minutes and we'll be right back. So once that's set up, you want to pull out the ear plug. A pair of needle nose pliers is pretty helpful for that, but it usually comes right out. Now we don't have a hole through the center right now because there's just a little bit of anchoring cement on top of where the ear plug was. So we just need to punch through there. You can do that a couple ways. You can just use the coring rod to poke through there, and that makes a nice little hole there. Another option would be a screwdriver that fits through that nozzle hole. You could bore up through there. I wouldn't recommend using your favorite screwdriver for that because you will be poking up through a little bit of concrete. But the coring tool actually works really good for just knocking out that little skin of anchoring cement. Make sure that the hole that you've created on the top is at least as large as the number 19 nozzle opening. Now there's a lot of moisture in that anchoring cement, and because we don't want moisture in contact with our fuel, we need to let this dry for a little while. Several hours is probably fine. I like to let them sit for overnight. Now that all the moisture is evaporated out of that anchoring cement, we need to block off the hole so that when we pour fuel in here, it doesn't just pour down out the nozzle. We're going to use the same earplug that we used when we built the nozzle. We'll just roll that up and compress it and put it back up into the nozzle. We'll push it up a little further than where it was before so it's set in. That'll help it seal up a little bit better on that hole in the top. We'll wait for that to expand and make sure that it seals up the opening in there very well. If it doesn't, we'll take it back out and put it in a little bit further. We want a good seal around the opening in the anchoring cement. Now we're going to measure out the components we need for the fuel. Zero out the weight of our container. And as I said before, we're maxing this motor out at 125 grams of total fuel. It's 65% potassium nitrate, 17% powdered sugar, and 18% corn syrup. So we need a total of 81.25 grams of potassium nitrate. Once we have the potassium nitrate, we'll zero out that quantity, and we need 21¼ grams of powdered sugar. Those are the two dry ingredients, so we'll just close that up and we'll mix that for a couple minutes just by hand. Next we need 22½ grams of our corn syrup. We're going to pour that directly into the pan, so we'll zero out that weight and get 22½ grams. We've got everything here ready to cook the fuel. Now before we do, we're just going to hit our coring rod and give it a nice light coating of the cooking spray, and also our little centering tool, just so those are ready so they don't stick to the fuel. We'll turn the cooktop on low. We just want to get to the point where the corn syrup just starts boiling. Once the corn syrup starts boiling, you can just carefully pour in our dry materials and we'll start mixing that up. I'm going to turn the heat up just a little bit. It doesn't take long for it to fully integrate into a blob of a material. You want to keep that moving. You don't want to turn the heat up too much, and keep checking the temperature of it with your temperature gun. We're looking for 230 degrees Fahrenheit. But keep it constantly moving so it doesn't burn. You should do this in a well-ventilated area. This does put off some fumes. Alright, so we're reading about 230 to 240 degrees. We're going to take it off the heat. Keep stirring that. We don't want it to burn because the pan is still very hot. It is easiest if you have somebody else available to hold the motor casing. If you don't, you might want to make a little jig to hold that up, because otherwise you might fall over while you're pouring the fuel in, and you really don't want that to happen. I'm going to pour the fuel in right in the center, scraping the edges of the pan to make sure that we get it all in. And then we'll just use our little plastic spoon here to scrape the rest off of the spatula. Alright, we've got it all in there. It's a little bit on the top here. We can just scrape that off and knock that down inside. And you see that we're quite a ways down. We're about an inch, maybe 1.25 inches down. That's okay, because when we put the coring rod in, that's all going to get pushed up. You can tamp that down just a little bit to even out the top. Put our little tool on the top here and pop that into the PVC, and then slide the coring rod down through the fuel. I'm going to push down on this little tool here to make sure that it doesn't pop up out of place. I'm just going to let this slide down with a little pressure, nice and slow. And when it stops, we know that we're all the way through and we're hitting the top of that little earplug that we put in the bottom. And we're going to let this sit for about 10 to 15 minutes until that cools down before we take the rod out. been about 15 minutes. It's still a little bit warm, but it's not really hot. Our tool will slide right off. Most of the time the coring rod will slide right out. You might have to grab onto it with a pair of pliers. And there's our fuel cell. Clean this off. There's some cooking spray on there that we don't want on the surface of the PVC when we glue our cap on. And to finish this off, we've got our last cap, and we're going to prime and glue that cap on. Now before we actually glue the cap on, we do want to pull out the earplug, because if we don't have a hole on the bottom here, it's going to be really hard to put the cap on. So we'll just use our needle nose pliers. Again, just pull gently on that, and it should come right out. There's a little skin of fuel there blocking the hole, so we want to open that up. We'll just use the screwdriver just to bore through that to open that hole up. Now we'll be able to put the cap on. Just like we put the other cap on, we're going to push it all the way, nice and tight, and then give it a quarter of a turn and hold that for about 20 seconds while that glue sets up. And that's the finished motor. Now, we want to let this set for at least a couple of hours to let that PVC cement completely harden. If you light it right now, there's a good chance the end cap's just going to blow off because that glue isn't completely set. We like to let these sit overnight. Now to light this type of motor, we use a fireworks igniter. This is a little electric igniter. It's got a little cap piece on here that we definitely don't want. We take that off, and that simply goes in to the motor like that. Now this is the nozzle end that's going to be down. The motor gets ignited from the top. Now bear in mind that the top has a dome here, and also the fuel is down a little bit inside there. So we don't want to push this all the way up so that this igniter is up all the way at the top of the cap. So we usually push it up and then pull it back down about 1/2 inch so that it's actually sitting down about in that location, or even a little bit lower. You definitely don't want it all the way up, otherwise you're just not going to ignite the fuel. Now while we let this set overnight, or if it's in storage for a long period of time, we want to take the earplug and put it into that opening and let that completely seal the opening up. That keeps moisture in the air from getting into the fuel. So before we head out, quick word about safety. This is an experimental motor. Now whether this is the first time that you've tested it or the 100th time that you've launched it, you always need to be safe. When we were building and testing this motor, we had explosions many times where pieces were being found over 400 feet away from the test site. So when you launch this or test it, everybody should be several hundred feet away every time. Practice safety, let's go launch. We're out here today to launch our new Class 1 Dart Monkey motor in our Class 1 rocket. Now you may have noticed that this motor does not have an ejection charge. We like to use a flight computer to handle the ejection charge for 3 reasons. Number 1, it makes the motor a lot easier to build if you don't have to build an ejection charge onto it. Number 2, the flight computer is going to detect when the rocket goes across apogee and deploy the parachute at the perfect timing. And number 3, the flight computer can also give us some other information about the flight. The one we're using today is just a real simple one. It'll tell us our total flight altitude. If you haven't seen the video for the making of our Class 1 rocket, I'll put a link on the screen at the end of this video. You can go check that out. We're going to get set up and launch. Fantastic launch. Flight computer says 1,102 feet. take a look at the video for the making of this rocket. Our next video is going to be a video for how to make this really nice parachute. It's a super simple, effective parachute for this size rocket. That'll be coming up real soon. If you like what we're doing, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.